in this part two. So we have been focusing on the short 32-word piyut that appears in the Machzor, and it appears there hard by the three blowings of the shofar that punctuate the unique Rosh Hashanah Musaf Amidah, as it's chanted by the Chazan for the congregation as a whole. So it's the piyut Yom Harat Olam. And we have seen two interpretations of it thus far. One of these, just in the briefest review, one of these eschewed the monotheistically problematic, even though it's apparent, but a problematic connection to conception and birth as descriptions of creation, God as the birther, and read it instead as being about judgment. The second interpretation did indeed start with the surface meaning of the word harat as conception and pregnancy, but it avoided the mythological trap of thinking of God as birthing the world. It avoided it by interpreting the piyut to be contrasting a biblical image of an indefinitely aborted birth rather than with God's creation, but instead contrasting that with the possibilities of rebirth in our own lives. So that's what we did on Monday. So you'll recall that I had the privilege in those first two, going through those first two interpretations, of quoting two rabbis who were among my teachers over the years, Rabbi Max Arzt and Rabbi Norman Lamb, both of blessed memory. Today, for our third interpretation, I again have the real zechut, the privilege of conveying the Torah, part of the Torah of my most important teacher. And for that purpose, I'm going to begin today with a verse from the book of Kohelet, Ecclesiastes. It's in chapter 5. It's the 11th verse in that chapter. And here's how it reads in English. A worker's sleep is sweet, whether he has much or little to eat, but the rich man's abundance doesn't let him sleep. So there's obviously a hard-nosed cynicism in here. What a surprise for the book of Ecclesiastes. It's full of cynical comments, imagining the person who has managed to eke out a living with his or her own hands, having at least that satisfaction and the hard sleep that comes with the hard labor. But the rich person is always wondering about what's going on in the markets in Singapore and in the middle of the night and is not able to sleep. But the Tanchuma, that Midrashic compilation, and for those of you who might want to look this up, it's in Parshat Ki Tisa, the Tanchuma, in the third section in Ki Tisa. The Tanchuma turns this hard-nosed cynicism into a description of a beautiful blessing enjoyed by very special people. And here are its words. Imagine a person, the Midrash says, who was fabulously wealthy in Torah. He taught many students. He lectured on the Torah publicly. He was completely suffused with Torah. Even though he may now be dead, the students whom he nurtured will not let him sleep. Rather, his students sit and they busy themselves with the Torah, Talmud, Halacha, Agadah that he taught. And moreover, the disciples cite his teachings. They mention his name all the time. And thus, they give him no slumber in his grave. In other words, the rich man's abundance doesn't let him sleep. So among the richest persons I ever knew in the Tanchuma's definition of wealth was Rabbi Gerson Cohen, Zichrono Livracha. And it's fitting that the Tanchuma describes a way of conquering death by being quoted. It's fitting that this is about conquering death because Rabbi Cohn delved deeply in his intellectual and in his spiritual work into the concept of immortality. And that is, in fact, the subject of the third interpretation of Yom Harat Olam. So now, if you will, I'm going to ask you to travel with me briefly along a tangent, but it's a tangent that I promise you the relevance of which will soon enough become evident. So I am now going to screen share something. Okay. A passage from a book by Rebecca Goldstein called Incompleteness. And let's see what this passage says. Is there anything we know more intimately than the fleetingness of time, the transience of each and every moment? Yet, strangely enough, it isn't so, not if we take Einstein's physics seriously. The book actually wasn't primarily about Einstein. It was about the logician Kurt Gödel, but he had a very strong friendship with Einstein, and a lot of that relationship is talked about in this book. So strangely enough, it isn't so about the fleetingness of time if we take his physics seriously. In Einstein's physics, there is no passage of time, no unidirectional flow away from the fixed past and toward the uncertain future. The temporal component of space-time is as static as the spatial components. Physical time is as still as physical space. It's all laid out, the whole spread of events in the tenseless four-dimensional space-time manifold. You can, by the way, imagine, if in a theological way, imagine God being able to survey in an instant, not having to wait for events to unfold because every point in space-time is already laid out, is there. As Einstein told Rudolf Carnap, another philosopher, the experience of the now means something special for man, something essentially different from the past and the future, but this important difference does not and cannot occur within physics. And now Goldstein continues, Einstein, living under the sword of Damocles, and that's a reference to the fact that he'd already been diagnosed with a growing and fatal abdominal aneurysm. He knew he was dying. He seemed to take comfort in his vision of tenseless physical objectivity. And listen now to this condolence letter that he wrote to the widow of his longtime friend and fellow physicist, Michel Besso. Einstein wrote to her, and he would die less than 5 weeks later. He wrote to her, in quitting this strange world, he has once again preceded me by just a little. Kind of little dark humor there. That doesn't mean anything. For us convinced physicists, the distinction between past, present, and future is only an illusion, albeit a persistent one. So part of what you see here hinges on the difference between two words, one of which is very familiar and the other of which is not very familiar. The words are eternal, the familiar one. The second word is sempiternal. The latter, sempiternal, is the word that should be used for what we quite often, though incorrectly, use the word eternal. Sempiternal means existing in the flow of time, yet on into the infinite future. Always there, at each moment of time. It's what Woody Allen was thinking of when he famously quipped that he didn't want to achieve immortality through his work, he wanted to achieve immortality by not dying. So that's sempiternity. Eternal, on the other hand, connotes being outside of time. Eternity, that is timelessness. It's beyond the changing, and therefore beyond the degenerating flow of time. Because time will degenerate everything in the end. Eternity is being outside of that. The passage here tells us that what physics had taught Einstein about eternity, about timelessness, that it was somehow in some sense here and now, and thus touchable in one's mind, all laid out, as he put it, that brought Einstein comfort as he was facing death. Rabbi Cohen actually loved to use fancy words. So he would talk about this, not using the word comfort, but using the word consolatio. And if it did that for Einstein, it could presumably and potentially do that for others. And not only those who are convinced physicists or those who are even mystically inclined. So enter now the great Jewish thinkers and poets of medieval Spain. I've taken you on this brief tangent because Gerson Cohen, among all of his riches, had a special love and a particular attachment to those exceptional Jews of the Iberian Peninsula. And so we're going to look next at one of those poets, Yehuda Halevi, and one of his poems. And in it, you are going to hear the contrast between, on the one hand, existence in time, and on the other hand, timelessness or eternity. So here comes the screen share again. We'll go to the next page. Here's Yehuda Halevi's poem, brief poem. It's a prelude to Nishmat, which on Shabbat morning. This is the translation here is from Raymond Shendlin, and it appears in his book, The Gazelle, which I find it hard to believe it's now 29 years since it appeared. It feels like it was just 5 years ago, but that's what time does to you, you see. It plays all sorts of tricks, which is part of the story of this poem. It starts with the word Yechida, the individual one, the only one. It's a word that was used for the soul in those circles. My soul, seek God at dawn. This tells you that it was meant for the Shacharit service. In fact, the Hebrew says Shachari, seek God at dawn, attend his house, and set your song like incense before him. Now it gets to the subject at hand. For if you run to try to trap time's vapors, translating here, havle zmanech, hevel means vapor, but because it means vapor, it means that which is vaporous, that which is evanescent, that which is here today and gone tomorrow, and therefore vain. That's why hevel in Ecclesiastes was so often translated as vanity. But it really is vapor. For if you've run to try to trap time's vapors, what is it like to try to trap vapor? Mistaking his illusions for the truth. And note the word illusion here, which is exactly the word that Einstein had used about time. Mistaking his illusions for the truth, and wander wayward night and day behind him, loving lazy mornings after nights of pleasure. Know that nothing really is your own except a tree whose boughs will one day wither. And then the poem gets in the last 4 lines to this line here, Hayi lifnei Elohayach umalkech. Then be before your Lord, your God and King, from whom you seek protection underneath his wing. His name be ever magnified and sanctified. Let every mouth that breathes his greatness sing. Nishmat, Asher Nishmat Eloah Chai Be'apav. So that's the introduction to Nishmat Kol Chai Tevarech et Shimcha. This is what it was written for. But what is this what is this poem now telling us? So first we notice, as I pointed out, how time is said to offer us illusions. Einstein said it's a persistent one, but in a larger, deeper sense, it is not the real picture of reality. What is offered here, as the positive contrast to what it describes as the usual human, the frantic and the incessant use of time to pursue things which time itself ultimately destroys. What's the contrast? The contrast is the verb that has no action or motion associated with it, the verb hayi, lihyot, be. So it's a vision here of somehow coming to rest, maybe coming to comfort, maybe coming to this consolatio in what we might call God's eye view, the view from eternity, the achievement of something of timelessness, even in this world of time. So with all of this kind of highfalutin stuff in our satchels, let's turn to our packet of text, to text number 5. It's in the source packet. It's on page 6. And as we turn to it, I'm going to ask you to be mindful of what we noted on Monday, namely that the original meaning of the word olam was not world, which is the ultimate fullness of space, but rather eternity, as in leolam va'ed, the ultimate fullness of time. That was its original meaning. So let's look at text number 5. So this is by Gerson Cohn, and it's an analysis of the thinking of the son of Maimonides, of the Rambam. He's known as Avraham Maimoni, Avraham ben HaRambam. And you get another sense. I said that he loved to use very fancy words. So soteriology is a word that you don't see very often. It means a theory of salvation. This theory of salvation of Abraham Maimoni, published originally in the American Academy of Jewish Research and then reprinted in this volume, Studies in the Variety of Rabbinic Cultures, which brought together a lot of Gerson Cohn's greatest hits. So let's see what he says here. In the view of Maimonides, that's the father, the ultimate reward of the righteous was not the messianic redemption and the resurrection connected with it. It's one of the things that made Maimonides controversial. The ultimate reward of the righteous was the incorporeal state of the soul in the world to come. And in attempting to understand Maimonides' reading of classical texts, Nachmanides, Ramban in the next century in Spain, noted that Maimonides' view of the sequence of eschatological rewards, the rewards for the righteous at the end of days, derived from Maimonides' understanding of that term, Olam Haba, translated here before as world to come. According to Nachmanides, Maimonides could say that Olam Haba was not a world to be created in the future. Let's pause here for a second, because most of us learning about this concept of Olam Haba, we have this vision of and view of it as something that is going to come at the apocalypse, that something discontinuous is going to happen, and everything is going to be swept away, and it will usher in the end of time, another world. Maimonides rejected that idea. He could say, back in the text here in the 6th line, that Ha'olam Haba was not a world to be created in the future, but one that was already in existence. One into which the souls of the righteous enter immediately after death. You don't go into some holding space for a long time until God ushers in the world to come. You leave this world and you go directly into the world to come that is already here. And Maimonides did that because he understood the Hebrew expression as it was used by the Andalusians, where he had come from Cordova, from Andalusia. That's how it was used by the thinkers and the sages in the Iberian Peninsula. Only among the latter, claimed Nachmanides, would one find the usage of the expression Ha'olam Haba as the state of immortality enjoyed by the soul at the present time, immediately after the death of the body. And not only was Nachmanides right, this is Gerson Cohen speaking, not only was he right that the Andalusians used the words Ha'olam Haba in that sense, not something that happens in the distant future, but something that we are being prepared to enter into immediately when we leave this world. Not only did they use the words in that sense, but evidence can also be adduced that they even used the single word olam and its inflections like olamo, olamcha, etc. in that sense. You didn't even have to say olam haba. Olam as eternity, as timelessness, meant being in that state. Now, Avraham Maimoni, the son, brought up under that curriculum, he absorbed such usage as a matter of course. And in his work, Milchamot Hashem, the Wars of the Lord, what was the war? I told you before, Maimonides was extremely controversial, had enormous critics, and his son decided to go to battle to defend his father. And that's what Milchamot Hashem was about. He composed in defense of his father's eschatology, his father's view of the end of time. He cited in proof, listen to this, that the state of incorporeal bliss is one reached by the great sages, even in the present world. The proof he gave for that was a Talmudic blessing that appears in Brachot 17a. Now I'm going to give you the translation of this in a moment. Olamcha tireh b'chayecha v'acharitcha l'chaye olam. You notice how the ante has been raised here? But it stands to reason that if Olam Haba is a state that we somehow can only enter into when we have freed ourselves from time, when we leave this world, but it's there waiting for us, it may be possible to have glimpses of it even in this world before we are dead, that we can have some sense of that timelessness, of the greater whole, of being able to assume the God's eye view of the world. Let me put this up here. Olamcha tireh b'chayecha v'acharitcha l'chaye olam. May you experience the eternity that is yours, olamcha, the eternity that is yours, that is available to you, b'chayecha, while you live. This is a blessing that we're told in the Talmud that the rabbis gave to Rabbi Ami when they left his house of study. May you experience the eternity that is yours while you live, and may your future thus be of life eternal. So this is a remarkable vision of the ability to kind of bootstrap ourselves beyond these illusions of time and the vanities of time and the things that we pursue day in and day out, and sometimes have a sense, can reach the sense of a certain kind of futility. But there's a grand reality of which we are part beyond it, and in some way we might be able to touch it. You know, years ago there was a religious programming series on NBC, and given our present exploration here today, it was aptly named The Eternal Light. Many of you will no doubt remember it. One of the most ambitious and memorable of those programs over the years was the one of Rabbi Gerson Cohen teaching for an hour on site in places such as Granada and Cordova and Toledo, teaching about the flourishing Jewish culture in Muslim Spain. The program was entitled Sunlight and Shadow. And standing on the ground in Toledo, he recited the words of another one of those beloved poets. This time it was not Yehuda Halevi. It was Solomon ibn Gabirol, the same one after whom that north-south artery in Tel Aviv is named, except they call it Ibn Gvirol for unknown reasons. So this is a poem by Solomon ibn Gabirol, a short excerpt from what is a very long poem known as Keter Malchut, the crown of kingship. To this day, that long poem, Keter Malchut, forms a part of the Yom Kippur liturgy in many Sephardic synagogues. So he was, in this program, he recited the words that I'm now going to put up on the screen. From Keter Malchut. Mi yagia lechochmatecha, b'titcha lanefesh koach hadat asher ba tekua. O Lord, who can reach thy wisdom? This translation here, by the way, from Israel Zangwill. O Lord, who can reach thy wisdom? For thou gavest the soul the faculty of knowledge that is fixed therein, and knowledge is the fount of her glory. Therefore hath destruction no power over her. But she maintaineth herself by the stability of her foundation. The stability, time disrupts stability. Timelessness is stability. For such is her nature and secret of the soul. And then the last line here is, V'hanefesh hachachama lo tir'eh mavet. The soul with her wisdom shall not see death. It was a rather extraordinary scene with him standing there in that Spanish city in the late 20th century, and reading those words on the air that had been composed there back in the 11th century. And he explained as he read it that Ibn Gabirol was teaching us how to gain immortality, as it were, in this life, in the same way that Abraham Maimoni and others had insisted that we should strive to do. And I suspect that in a very deep place inside his own mortal self, Rabbi Cohen might have felt that this is, after all the immortality that we truly need. Not in the vulgar way that Woody Allen did so much that was vulgar, that he thought of immortality by not dying, sempiternity, that this was the immortality that we should really be looking for, to be able to have this sense of oneness. So in speaking about the Sabbath, some of you will remember that Heschel used the phrase, eternity utters a day. And here now, the favor is returned, because here we're talking about a particular day, the day of Rosh Hashanah, at the beginning of Tishrei, uttering eternity, and presenting it to us if we would only somehow learn to pay attention. The idea was a very precious one to this teacher of mine, who taught us that the rabbis of Spain understood the Talmudic blessing, may you see your olam in your lifetime, to mean that a state of some spiritual bliss and blessedness can be reached even in the midst of the present world. So let's finally go back to the words of the Piyut, Harat Olam. So the great Hebrew linguist, whose name was Abba ben David, he noted that the word harat, which we saw last time, is the biblical root for conceiving, carrying life within one, or eventually giving birth. So Abba ben David noted that harat came to be used in modern Hebrew in such phrases as harat goral and harat sakanot, the meanings being fraught with destiny, harat goral, fraught with dangers, harat sakanot. He said that was because that's what harat had always really meant. It had meant being laden with something, being fraught with something. carrying that freight. And so, for Rabbi Cohn, and I remember the day that he said this to me, and sort of came out with this. He must have said it to others at different times. He said that this is what Yom Harat Olam meant, exactly what those poets and philosophers in Spain were pointing to. Today is fraught with eternity. Except that Rabbi Cohn characteristically preferred to give it a somewhat more earthy sound. He not only liked fancy words, he sometimes liked earthy phrases. So he didn't say today is fraught with eternity. Hayom Harat Olam he translated as today is pregnant with eternity. Hayom Harat Olam. And that's our third meaning. Rosh Hashanah is, or can be, pregnant with eternity. For if we take what's offered to us on that holy day, says this piyut, we might be able to bring forth into our lives a long view, a broad view, a view from eternity that might be able to put our time-bound travails into some larger perspective. And maybe that brings some comfort and consolatio. And then, of course, the rest of the piyut follows. Because how does the piyut continue? Hayom ya'amid b'mishpat. You know, it's interesting. Hayom ya'amid b'mishpat. It doesn't say who the subject is. Right? Hayom harat olam, hayom ya'amid. Ya'amid will make us stand in judgment. Who will make us stand in judgment? It doesn't say God will, which is why most of the translations say we will find ourselves standing in judgment or something like that. It becomes kind of passive. Hayom ya'amid b'mishpat, we're going to be in judgment. Im kevanim, im ka'avadim. Whether we're going to be children or whether we're going to be servants. So how does the rest of this piyut that I've just described, how does that follow from this idea of today is fraught or pregnant with eternity? Are we going to be like children? Or I would even add to that students, disciples, getting back to the Tanchuma. Will we be like children who see ourselves, as children should, as part of an unending, timeless chain of which we are essentially a part? One with our ancestors and our descendants? Will we see ourselves that way? Or are we going to be and are we going to live like mere servants? Because what do servants do? They play out a utilitarian quid pro quo. I serve you for this, I get in return whatever it's going to be. But those utilitarian quid pro quos in the end die with us. And so that is the choice that is really harat goral, that is fraught with destiny. So that's interpretation number 3. Hayom Harat Olam. Today is pregnant with eternity, understanding the difference between time and timelessness, between sempiternity and eternity. Highfalutin words, I understand, but I think that all of us have some sense of what it might mean and why it may be important in our lives to be able to just get ourselves off that relentless plane of time to see a greater whole. I think we probably can afford 5 minutes here if there are people who would like to make any comments. Some of you perhaps already have, before we go on to the 4th and final interpretation.
And Rabbi Tucker, we've actually gotten a number of people who are interested in if there's a way for them to get access to the sources you shared on the screen.
I'm sorry, they would like to have those sources. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Well, so what I'll do is I'll send them to you, and or I should do that now is what I should do, right? Because you want to be able to post it in the chat. Or some, wait a minute.
Yes,
how we,
if there, yeah, I did find out that there is an ability that I can send an email to everyone who is
afterwards, or you have to do it during this. No, so I can send it to you afterwards. Okay.
Yes.
I see there was a question about clarifying what I meant by the mythological trap of the birthing God. Just that, you know, the tradition that from the Torah on has done so much to try to distance God from the mythological sexuality and the consorts of gods and gods being birthed and birthing in turn. So the idea, and this makes this very unusual, this metaphor for creation as birth. So it gave everyone the willies, basically, and tried to distance themselves from it in interpreting this this piyut.
Sue Fendrick said that she has a comment she wanted to share with you.
Yeah, Gordon, I must tell you this, which is that I think there is probably no single thing that your students quote among ourselves more than your giving over of Gersten Cohen's "Today is Pregnant with Eternity." So just in terms of all of the layers of people coexisting in time and the rich not being able to sleep because people are citing their words and all of the themes that are in this shiur, I really feel the need to share that with you. This just recently came up in a rabbinic discussion, interpretations of this, and a number of us said that this was one of our chief associations. So
I have seen some of this in various websites that I've ended up on, and which is very nice. The only thing I wish they would do is credit it to Gersten Cohen.
Often it is, at least in my knowledge. So
yeah, okay. I've seen it a lot unattributed.
Got it.
And he deserves to have it attributed to him.
Got it.
Okay. Can you suggest how to achieve this timeless eternity on Rosh Hashanah? Well, as I said last week when I was doing a couple of sessions on climate change, this was not meant as a practicum. So I'm going to I'm going to sound like I'm punting on this, but I don't think, you know, if there were an algorithm for this that all of us could follow, I think that would in a way miss the point. I think what we have to have is an aspiration and a vision of what could be, and we have to find it within ourselves to be able to, as I put it before, to kind of bootstrap ourselves up to it. That may not be very satisfying. That's the best that I can do. Okay, let's move on. So the fourth and final one is a most what I find to be a most personal reading by someone who was not a teacher of mine, other than the fact that she became a teacher of mine by my learning and encountering and learning from her in this particular article. And it's by Sarah Friedland Ben Arza, a teacher of Torah and Midrash and Chassidut. She's an affiliate of Beit Hillel. As they would say in Yiddish, a chashuv mensch, an important person. I want you to note, by the way, this is text number 6, and we're going to turn to it just in a moment. I want to note that the way these things get formatted when the very talented people on the Hartman staff do this formatting, there was no way to get the Hebrew correctly here. So you have the URL for the website here, and the Hebrew is all in, you know, kind of in reverse order. It's reading from left to right, but it's, you know, Ma'amar Harat Olam / Al-Leidat HaOlam B'Rosh Hashanah is the name of the article, and you'll figure out how to get to that website in the correct way. So let's read the first paragraph here. This is my own translation of the article, which is in Hebrew, obviously. The use of birth imagery for creation is not common in Jewish sources, as we just noted. And this is understandable given the transcendence of the God of Israel. That's about the mythological trap. Birth images assume a continuum of species identity between the begetter and the begotten. That's why it's kind of a theological trap. You talk about God birthing the world. A birth means there's a species connection between the birther and the birthee and the birthed. And in the Jewish world, even though the Shekhinah may place itself in this world, and even though humans are created in the image of the deity, there is yet an unbridgeable gap between an exalted and eternal God and a limited creature. And for that reason, the use of other images for the creation of humans was preferred. You know, Vayipach bi'apav nishmat chayim, God blowing the breath of life, or even more antiseptically, so to speak. The first chapter of Genesis is done entirely without any touching, without any physical proximity. It's just people are created, right, by verbal fiat. So she points all of this out, but she's nevertheless going to take on this monotheistic challenge by bringing us back to the understanding of the opening phrase of the prayer as indeed referring to the birth of the universe and to God as the birther. And that's a kind of a risk, but she's going to do it for a particular purpose that we're now going to see. So let's continue now with the next paragraph. So thus our liturgical poem contains a twofold deviation from the norm. It's exceptional in relating to the event of birth. That makes it exceptional to begin with. But in addition, the image it conveys is not that of a male seeder of the world, as you know, a mazriya, but rather of a pregnant mother, Harat Olam. We're focused on the emergence from the womb, rechem. You know, the piyut contains the word rachamenu kerachem al banim, rechem, the emergence from the womb, that is on birth itself as the metaphor for creation. And in this way, a continuity and an imminent connection between the creator and the creature receive an emphasis and a particular force. As contrary as that normally would be seen to be to the insistence on the transcendence of God and that there is no species identity between humans and God. This piyut, she claims, is boldly taking that on. And then she is going to ask eventually why this image of conception and birth is inserted into the liturgy that's primarily about God's sovereignty and about judgment, which would fit very well with the transcendence. Why do we suddenly have this very earthy birthing imagery? And why just after the shofar is blown? Because that's where I began today. As I put it, it's hard by the shofar. The first thing you do after the shofar is blown in those central places in the Musaf is, I lamented a little bit on Monday that usually it's a big mumble. Yom Harat Olam, but that's what you do right after the shofar. Why is that? Why just after the shofar is blown? So she's going to ask those questions, but first she's going to make another very perceptive observation. If the imagery of conception and birth stands out as unusual in the liturgy, which is mostly about other themes, sovereignty, remembrance, judgment, that imagery of parenting, birthing, being a child, the destiny of children, all of that is at the very heart of every single one of the scriptural readings that were chosen for this holiday. The Torah reading for day 1 and day 2, the Haftarah for day 1 and day 2. And just to remind you of all of this, I'm going to put it up. And here we go. So, first day of Rosh Hashanah. What do we have here? The Lord took note of Sarah as he had promised, Sarah conceiving and giving birth to Isaac. Later on, Sarah saw the son whom Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham playing, and she said to Abraham, cast out that slave woman and her son. So we have the Sarah conceiving and giving birth to Isaac, but we also have Yishmael, Abraham's son, being exiled from his home. The second day, the famous chapter 22 of Genesis, which is known as the Akedah, Isaac being nearly lost through sacrifice. And at least in the text, at the very end when he is saved, I don't actually have that all the way to the end here, but you'll remember that it says that Abraham went back with his servants to Beersheba. Nothing is said about Isaac. So at least in the text, Isaac is not only nearly lost to his father, and we don't know anything about what Sarah's doing here, but we'll get back to that. But at least in the text, Isaac at this point disappears from his parents' lives in the sequel. Just not there anymore until he buries Abraham after he dies. Parents and children torn apart. The Haftarah for the first day, the beginning of 1 Samuel, Hannah. After they had eaten and drunk at Shiloh, Hannah rose. In her wretchedness, she prayed to the Lord. If you will look upon the suffering of your maidservant and remember me and not forget me, if you'll grant your maidservant a male child, I will dedicate him to the Lord for all the days of his life. Probably a rash vow that she came to regret because she was so desperate to have a child, but didn't realize that the fulfillment of that was going to require her to give up the child. Hannah conceiving and giving birth to Samuel is the theme of that first day's Haftarah, and then having to give him away to the sanctuary in order to fulfill that vow. And then finally, the Haftarah for the second day. Od evnech v'nivnet. I will build you firmly again, O maiden Israel. And by the way, Israel here means the northern kingdom of Israel. Again, you shall take up your timbrels, because this is Jeremiah living a century after the exile of that northern kingdom. You're going to plant vineyards on the hills of Samaria. Samaria is in the northern kingdom. He's talking about the children coming back. Vishavu vanim ligvulam. The children will come back to their proper place, their proper borders. And the major image that we have here, of course, is a cry is heard in Ramah, wailing, bitter weeping, Rachel weeping for her children, refusing to be comforted for her children who are gone. And it's going to focus on Ephraim, who, of course, is the standard bearer of the northern kingdom. And Ephraim is from Joseph, and Joseph was Rachel's firstborn, the one she prayed for and that she finally gave birth. So Rachel, whose barrenness had finally ended, is left to cry over the children that she bore out of pain, who have also gone into exile. So it's remarkable. There's no other holiday. First of all, there's no other holiday in which we read from the book of Breshit. No other holiday in which we read these kinds of homey and homely stories about domestic life, about parents and children. And it's all here on Rosh Hashanah. You can't avoid it on both days. And that's one of the things that Ben Arza points out in this article. So what is this in the end all about? So Ben Arza's answer is that by analogizing our relationship to the Holy One, by analogizing our relationship to God, by using Harat Olam, to the relationship of parents and children, and using the vivid narratives of parents and children to evoke spiritual depth on these days through the scriptural readings. The tradition is trying to direct our thoughts to God through the things that we already know. So it's not really talking about God as the birther. It's talking about the things we know about ourselves in our lives because of the cycles of birth and parenting and the dynamics between parents and children, using that which we know to try to imagine what it might be like to be God on this day of Rosh Hashanah, looking down at us. Let's look at the remainder of her text, the bottom of page 7, that last paragraph. This is a minimalist midrashic move. She says, just using the, it's not hitting us over the head with it. It's just asking us to read these stories in the Tanakh. Without adding a single word of their own, the sages presented us with a narrative about the day by placing these 4 readings at center stage. These chapters succeed in creating a correspondence between the relationship of the Holy One to the world and the relationship of parent to offspring. And it thus presents Rosh Hashanah as a day of birth. The foundational story of the world born on this day, as it is laid out for us by means of these parental narratives, is the story of a world that halts its journey each year on its day of birth and looks back with yearning towards the womb from which it emerged. It's the story of a world in exile, like that of Ishmael and Ephraim, that senses the distance between it and its progenitor. We become distanced from God whenever it reaches the day of its conception and birth. And the next step, of course, is now to try to reverse it and imagine, what is God feeling? So we go to the next page. Moreover, since the scriptural readings do not make philosophical statements, but are rather stories, they invite us to read them in such a way that we can identify with more than one character in the tale. Yeah, we can identify with Abraham and Sarah and Ishmael and Hannah, all of them. But there's another character in the tale. Indeed, this kind of deep reading can bring the worshiper and the reader to share in the pain of the Holy One, the parent, who must face the distancing of the children. On Rosh Hashanah, say the sages, God created the human being, and each year on the day of the birth of humanity, God measures once again the gap that ever widens in proportion to humanity's maturity and to the complexities of its life paths. By means of empathy with Abraham's need to part with his 2 sons, with Hannah, who must relinquish her child to God's service, and with Rachel crying for her exiled children, it becomes possible to relate to the day of creation not only from the point of view of judgment, but also from the perspective of compassion, rachamim, which of course comes from rechem, womb. You see, we may not have experienced exactly what Sarah and Abraham and Hannah and Rachel went through, but many of us are parents, and all of us are children. Many or most of us have participated in the hopes and disappointments of planning for children. We've all been the receivers of the gift of life from our parents. And all of us at some point insisted on taking those lives in the directions that we wanted to take them in, not that our parent wanted us to take them in. Parents have experienced their children's separation as an exile as much as they have known that the separation was inevitable. And children too, while they were traveling their own paths, they have felt the pangs of separation each time they remember their parents' dreams for them, however unrealistic they were. I was supposed to be a lawyer. Didn't happen. A necessary exile, but still accompanied by pain. And sometimes there's a recognition that not every aspect of the separation was entirely necessary after all. You know what I'm talking about here. This is the life that we understand. These are the dynamics that we live through. So perhaps we can come to understand that our separation from God just might be painful in just that way to the divine parent. But what about the question of how all of this is connected, as it is in the Machzor, to the blowing of the shofar? So here, Ben Arza draws our attention. It's not in the text that you have. I'm going to tell you about it. She draws our attention to a midrash that appears in the 32nd chapter of the late midrash, Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer. And here's the midrash. You know at least part of this, if not all of it. When Abraham returned from Mount Moriah, Samael, that's basically Satan, was piqued that he had not succeeded in foiling Abraham's willingness to go through with God's command. Kept trying to divert him, but he eventually got to Mount Moriah and was willing to carry it out. God just stopped him, but this, Samael was really piqued that he failed. So he decided to do a different kind of mischief. He came to Sarah and said, "Have you heard the news?" And Sarah said, "No." He said, "Oh, your old man took young Isaac and offered him up as a sacrifice." And the child wailed, Yalal, Yalal, since he could not be saved. So immediately Sarah began to cry and to wail. And now Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer says the following: 3 times crying corresponding to 3 tikiyot, and 3 times wailing, miyalelet, corresponding to 3 yevavot. Yevavot are what we call shvarim and teruah. And there now is the stunning connection between the crying of parents and the shofar sounds in the Musaf. We have sometimes sobbed and wailed about such things in our lives, making sounds something like the shvarim and the teruah of the shofar. That immediately after those sobbing and wailing sounds of the shofar, Yom Harat Olam, in the way she reads it, deliberately gives us the bold and risky image of God's womb that conceived us, so that we can understand that there is a source that is always concerned and always willing to embrace us when a path that we have chosen has failed us. And it does this so that we can empathize with God as the parent who can't hold on to children, but can't quite bear to let them go either. A God who feels pain, a God who wails, as it were, when the paths that find us in life are destructive, when the paths that don't find us, that we find, that we ourselves have chosen, are not good paths. A God who longs to see us return. At least that's what this piyut and its placement in the service asks us to imagine. Going back to the translations that we saw at the very beginning on Monday from different Machzorim, the very last one was the one from Machzor Lev Shalem. Maybe that's why Machzor Lev Shalem translates the phrase, Hayom Harat Olam, today the world stands as at birth. Because it's not merely an anniversary of an act of creation that brings God and us together here, but it's a parent-child drama that is universal in scope. It's majestic in its ramifications, and it is enacted, not just remembered, it's enacted each year. It's enacted in our lives, potentially each day. And we're urged to think of God in the terms that we know best, having all been children, if not parents. So with this, we complete our survey of 4 different ways of reading and taking to heart these 32 words. They're all 4 of them, all different from one another, each, I think, powerful and suggestive in its own way. I hope and trust that they will provide us all with additional enrichment on the upcoming days of awe. They are surely going to be the most unusual and challenging days of awe that most of us have ever had. We can use a little extra depth and a little extra enrichment, and I hope that this has provided some of that.